Hey, Firebrand X here with a hands-on video this time. Some of you have probably seen Voltar do these videos before, which is when somebody buys an RGB modded console off of eBay and they didn't get pictures of the insides, what the mod looks like, so they have no idea what they're getting. And 9 times out of 10, what they end up getting is garbage. Garbage in, garbage out. So they reached out to me and they said they were getting very bad picture quality on their OSSC. So I had them send me a video of what it looked like, and yes, it was really bad. There was wavy lines going through it, and so I asked them what cable they were using, and they were using retro gaming cables, and I know those are pretty good, so that likely wasn't the problem. So then I asked them, well, if you can, open the console and take pictures for me of what it looks like on the inside with the RGB bypass mod. And they did, and what they sent me just horrified me, and I'll show it to you here when I open this up. It's just ungodly, the mess that's in there, but you'll see. So I'm going to completely remove all of that mess. Do an overhaul where I'm going to replace a voltage regulator with a 78 SO5. I'm going to throw in an anti-ghosting cap and Voltar's RGB bypass board. And I'm going to do this all free of charge for the guy because I felt bad for him, and I wanted to do this video to show that, you know, professionals like Voltar can do this, but you know, you and I can do this too, you know, if we're just hobbyist solderers and, you know, modders. Sometimes the professional method is actually easier and simpler to do and gives you better results. So why not go that route? And you know, the more people that do this, the less customers are going to get burnt on eBay buying this kind of garbage. So let's go ahead and get right to it. I'm going to go ahead and take this guy apart. One thing I like to do is lay down some bubble wrap here so that when I turn the console over and undo the screws, I'm not going to like scuff it against the table or anything like that. So then I'm going to use this game security bit driver that I got off of console5.com. So shout out to them. Love these guys. They're great, nice and sturdy. So let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look here. Alright, and this is this LED mod. I noticed, like I say, when I turned it on that it's a purple LED they've got in there, and it's really frickin' bright. They must have like 5 volts going into it. It probably has a resistor in there, but they're just not using enough because when I tried it, it was just way too bright. Like I say, it was like a laser beam burning into my retina, and you know, you can customize these by adding more resistance to them to, you know, lower that voltage and make it so where it's, you know, more subtle. You can see it, but it's not going to be distracting with how bright it is. And also, I noticed that it was not working altogether completely. Like when I first tried it, it didn't work. And then I sort of jiggled this wire and it came on and then back off again. So it's really not secure. And then I noticed actually when I tug on it, it actually is not even really glued in there. There's like a hole they drilled. See, there you go, and it just comes right out. So that's, I'm not really sure that's very professional. I guess in a way it's good that they didn't glue it because you can get it out of there pretty easy. But at the same time, since it was coming off and on just from jiggling it, there's probably some really bad soldering work done in there. But let's take a look at the main issue going into the underside of this board. By the way, Bob at Retro RGB, shout out to him for this screwdriver kit. It works great for most occasions. Occasionally I found that you actually can't use it, and it's because of this wide neck here, and even on the extension it has this kind of wide neck. There's some consoles where that won't fit through, and so you just have to get a regular screwdriver, like you know, like one like this, where it's just, you know, straight solid skinny metal, and that will fit through the slots on some of those consoles that this guy won't work on. Anyway, let me go ahead and finish this. Oh. Have to be careful with these guys. You don't want to strip or do anything bad to these screws here. So just be very gentle. You also don't want to over-tighten them either. Actually, none of these screws you want to over-tighten, not even the case ones, because those can cause dimples in the upper shell, and I'm sure some of you have already heard about that before. Alright, so there's one up here I need to get to. Should get it out of there. Let me see. Yeah, okay. Alright, well, let's have a look at it. Oh, look at that beautiful work. I mean, it just doesn't get any better. That's just a class job right there. I mean, look at that. They even ran out of shrink tubing and had to use electrical tape, I guess. And it looks like they're using a 7314 for the video RGB output driver. Looks like they got some resistors here, and then they've got some sort of exposed wiring here. It's probably even Kynar wire. It looks. I think it is Kynar wire, which Voltar and I both don't agree with that for video lines either. And it's just some gloppy solder work. And on the LED mod, notice they took power from the voltage regulator directly, and then ground over at the power switch. I'm gonna redo this part as well, because you can actually pull both power and ground from the reset button. There's a power pin there, there's a ground pin there, so why not have both right there instead of having all this crap go across the board like this? I mean, it's probably safe as it is, but we can make it much more efficient by doing it from there. So first things first is I'm going to just desolder all of this garbage and get it the hell out of here. Yeah, so that's where we're going to go from here. Alright, so now I've got my soldering iron, and I'm just going to start undoing all of this crappy work here. That's out of there. Recondition those pins, sort of reflow all that solder on these pins so that when I install Voltar's RGB bypass board, it will fit nice and neat on there, because this guy really, he glopped this crap up. And it looks like he used rosin flux instead of no clean, so there's a bunch of goopy, rosin sap on there, whatever it is. But yeah, that's pretty awful. Let's see here. Looks like next, I want to leave this LED thing on because I want to show you guys something with that a little later. So let me just see if I can get these out first. There we go. think that's it for the connections. So I'm just going to pull this off. I don't care if I break this crap. Main thing is to save this console. So I may have to apply some rubbing alcohol just to kind of loosen up that stickiness. Get that going. That's pretty clean. So I'm going to pause and let it dry, and then we'll come back and I'll show you something about this LED here. So I was going to show you the LED sort of working and not working by bending it a little bit, and it would come on, but I couldn't get it to come on at all, and I found out why. As I peeled away the shrink tubing layer, I discovered that the anode and cathode leads were wrapped in electrical tape, so I had to slowly peel that off, and I discovered that the resistor here the soldering joint had snapped, and it's because this wire that's used on it is very thick. It's very high gauge wire, very stiff, and so the act of bending it was stressing that resistor, and it just made that glob of solder just snap it clean off. I measured it. It looks like it was a 1K resistor that was on there, but I've got my own purple LED. It was a purple LED, but I got my own set of purple LEDs here, so I'm gonna just completely replace this and this wiring. Don't need to go with this really stiff, thick, heavy gauge wiring. So I'm going to totally rewire this so that there's not so much stress on the resistor and the other lead, and I'll properly shrink tube them instead of using electrical tape, because that was just very shoddy. Left all this black crusty residue on there from the heat probably melting the electrical tape. So just wanted to show you that this was just another part of the shoddy job that was done here. So I'm going to get all that fixed too. So let's get back to it. Alright, so here I'm just going to go ahead and desolder the power and ground wires for that LED indicator. Let's just start with the ground here. There we go. And then I'm going to go ahead and get some wick and wick off all this excess solder and just do a reflow on these various spots. And I'm also going to wick off these vias for the RGB and sync. I'm going to go ahead and reflow the ground where they soldered that power LED indicator to. So go ahead and get some flux in there. Get this fixed up. There may just be too much solder on there, in which case I'm going to have to wick some of it off. And that's a little better. That's not too bad right there. It'll focus, I don't know. It looks okay. Alright, moving on. Alright, well the next thing I want to do, at least for now, is remove the voltage regulator that's on there. And then later on we're going to replace it with this 78 S05. I've got one left here, so we'll throw it on there. But we'll do that after we've already got Voltar's board wired up and everything. So the first thing I'm going to do is take the heat sink off. I think we'll just start with the screw that actually screws the voltage regulator into it. There we go. Alright, now I'm going to take this S99 3A knockoff desoldering gun and use that to go ahead and desolder this guy. Let's see if I can do this in the camera view here. Oh, guys, this should be pretty much in view. Going to take a while for it to heat through that solder. There it goes. That's one down. Two. And it just falls right out. And there's the old one. Alright, and we'll install the 78 S05 after we do Voltar's board, which is going to be next. Okay, so actually I lied. The first thing I want to do here is actually remove this capacitor on C11 and do the anti-ghosting capacitor fix. I like to use 470 NF, as I call it. You probably use slightly less, like somewhere around 330 NF, but I prefer to be absolutely certain, so I go with 470. Now, the thing with this fix is it gets rid of the ghosting, and this particular SNES Junior has severe ghosting. I checked it out on the OSSC, and it's got really bad ghosting, so this is definitely a must-have. But the thing about this fix is some Capcom games that have letterboxing on the top and bottom, the top couple of lines will start to darken due to this capacitor being, upgraded, with a higher value. There have been patches people have made where you can download ROMs and patch them to where this cap fix doesn't mess with that anymore. But just so you know, it's a kind of a trade-off. Those few games, those letterbox games like that, whereas everything else is crystal clear, and so I actually don't mind. I prefer doing this fix. So I am actually going to use my hot air station. There's several different ways of doing this. You can use an iron with a blade edge and sort of heat both sides of the capacitor and scrape it off. But I'm going to do it the safest way, if you will, with hot air. So I'm going to get it up to temp, and then I'm going to turn the air pressure down a bit. I'm going to use 385 degrees Celsius. I don't like to go above anything above 400. So let me turn this down. Alright. Just have to heat it up for a bit to loosen it. There it goes, and it's right off. Turn the air back up and let this cool off faster. Alright, so with that removed, I'm going to go ahead and wick off the excess solder on these pads to make soldering the new cap on there a lot easier. There we go. That'll make it a lot easier to put that new one on there. And get some rubbing alcohol and clean it off a bit. There we go. Just put the new cap on there, 470 NF. Like I said, that's what I like to use. I like this this chisel tip here. It's just great for these little guys. Let me get that screwed on and secured. Heat it up. Can hardly wait to get that Capacitor T12. This Weller, it takes a while for it to get to temperature, so I'll be very glad to get that new soldering station in, so I don't have to wait so long. I'm still waiting on this thing to heat up. Alright, now it's finally ready. I'll just put a little dab of solder on the tip itself. That's one side. I'll spin it around and do the other side. Alright, spun it around. Gonna Try to tack the other side. Here we go. That looks pretty good now. Yep. Alright, we're good. So looking at these pins again, I think there actually is a little bit too much solder on them, so I'm going to wick some of that off and then just reflow them with fresh solder. I think there's just a tad too much. I know it's going to get in the way of installing Voltar's board, so I'll just start wicking some of that off. Like I say, I'll reflow this to make it look nice and neat when I go back through with the iron. That's pretty good there. Alright, so I've wicked off most of the solder on these pins, so now I need to go back and reflow just to make sure they're connected to the vias, but just enough. This is a ground one, so it's going to take a while to heat up. There it goes. Just enough. That's good. Now I'm going to spin it around and do the other side. Ground ones again, they just take a while to heat up. There it goes. Okay, yeah, that'll be great for the bypass board. There's just enough solder on there. That should work out great. Let me go ahead and clean it off with some rubbing alcohol. Yeah. I can't really focus too well. But yeah, it's going to work out great. Now, before I install Voltar's RGB bypass board, we've got these pins that stick up from the board. Let me tilt it so you can see them. We're going to flush cut all four of those off. They really don't need to be sticking out like that, and they will get in the way of his board, so we'll just flush cut those babies right off. Actually, I should use my thumb or finger to stop it from shooting out of there. There we go. There. Now his board will lay nice and flat and flush onto the pins. Alright, so here I've got Voltar's actual RGB mod board, and after wicking off the excess solder and reflowing those pins, it should drop right into place. Now there's something I do that Bob from Retro RGB also does, and that is I put a piece of electrical tape on the back of it. It's probably not necessary, but like Bob, I just like to be, it's better to be safe than sorry. I'm sure it's designed where you don't need it, but I like that extra precaution anyway. Let me see if I can just fit it over those pins and see if it'll drop right into place. And there we go, perfect. So now all I got to do is just solder those pins in place, and we're going to do that right now. In fact, while I'm waiting, I'll go ahead and re-wet these with the influx. Don't be afraid to drown it in flux either. More never hurts. Alright, now we're at temp. There we go, there's one. Let me go ahead and do the other side, just kind of balance it out. I'm just going to do each one of them like that. Make sure I'm still in frame there, okay. That's about all of them. Yeah, I think we're pretty good. We got a little too much on that. There we go. All right, that's installed. Let me go ahead and clean it off. Take a magnifying glass and inspect my work here just to make sure everything looks good. Yeah, those joints are thoroughly soldered, so we're good to go there. Alright, so what I've tried to do here is sort of lay some rainbow ribbon wire across, and I've started to strip the lines and kind of stagger them in this angle such that I'm not going to actually be bending the wire to reach the pads of the bypass board. And I, when stripping this 28 AUG rainbow ribbon wire, I used to use these here, and they work okay for cutting multiples at right angles. But I found for individual wire stripping, like what I've started doing here, is I actually use these guys here, and they work great. They got solid core wire on the left and stranded wire on the right, so I just line up to 28 stranded there on the right and just clamp and pull, and it yanks the jacket right off without cutting into any of the actual wire strands. So that's how I've been doing this. So let me go ahead and finish up these individual angle cuts. Then I'm going to bend the tin wires down at like a right angle so they'll fit down into the vias, and then I'll show soldering that next. Alright, through the magic of editing, I've finished stripping the wires and tinning them, and I've bent the lower ones down at a 90-degree angle and fitted them in the via holes for RGB and C-Sync. Yellow line is C-Sync, and the other three are red, green, and blue. Of course, they're not color-coded match. My OCD apparently does have a bound to it. But I will say that this tool here, this is so much better than using that other wire stripper. This is the tool you want to use for this kind of job. It made it so much easier. I wish I had purchased one of these, a year ago. So this is definitely the kind of tool you want to use for this, and of course it was 28 AUG wire. Fitted through the 28 AUG hole for multi-strand, and it's stripped perfectly without cutting any of the actual strands. It just does a great job. So now I'm going to go ahead and try to solder these bottom parts here to the vias. Some of the vias were kind of burnt and lifted from the previous, crappy mod work. But I made the tinned wires long enough that they just poke out the other side on the intact vias on top, and if need be, I can just sort of do a little tiny tack job on those on the other side. And I probably will anyway, just to make sure we've got a nice solid connection on all of these vias here. So let me go ahead and get started on that, and then we'll go ahead and solder the top part to the RGB bypass board. So I'm just going to flood the area with some flux. And probably I'll just tack them on there and see if I can get them. Alright, that one got in there. C-Sync is done. It doesn't matter if I fill that via with solder. The main thing is getting these ones that the wires are in. Alright, so really the blue one I'm not so sure about. Actually, those middle two, and give myself enough room to really get in there. Take a look and see. It looks like we're good. Well, my apologies. Camera had a malfunction there while I was recording the previous segment of soldering these wires into the vias. Got them tacked in there pretty good, but just in case, because the vias were kind of damaged from the previous mod work, I can flip this over, and if I can get some light over here. And over in here are those RGB and C-Sync lines. Right there, right there, right there, right there. And I can go ahead and do some tack soldering. They actually poke up, about a ½ millimeter up. I kind of guesstimated and got a pretty good guess on clipping the wires, the tinned wires, so that they stick up about a ½ millimeter out of those vias on this side. So I'm going to go ahead and tack them on this side just to be doubly sure that I've got a good connection on those lines. So we're going to go ahead and do that now. That's good for that one. Try to make sure we get good lighting there. Yeah, that got that one pretty good. Yeah, those actually look really good. Alright, we're now back on the other side. I'm going to go ahead and solder in place these lines to the RGB bypass board. Try to get it lined up. I may even use these tweezers. Actually, what I need is flux. More flux. There we go. First one in. Now the next one. Alright. For the red line, even though it's a green wire. Excellent. And where it was slightly off a little bit was on the C-sync line. I didn't get my my OCD was a little off today. Sorry about that. I'd like to have gotten it a little bit closer, but this is not bad. Yeah, you can see how it's just not quite up there. But that will definitely do. And you can see minimal, absolutely minimal wire distance from vias to the bypass board. And that's really all there is to it for RGB. I mean, this is done. But let me go ahead and wire up S-Video, which is going to wrap around to the other side. So we'll get started on that. I'll do the wires and tin them up and get going on that. Alright, so here we are on the top side. I'm going to hook up Luma and Chroma for S-Video. I've already stripped the wires and tinned the ends and shaped them, and I'm kind of going to try and go from inside the chip out to the pins kind of thing and position them like so. So let's see if we can get this going. Alright, that one's in there. Looks like Luma is going to be a little bit harder because I'm going to have to twist it. This is pointing up and I need it to be pointing more downward and sideways. That should help a little bit. It's going to be that pin right there. Hopefully I'm not blocking the view. This is a lot harder trying to do this on a camera. Normally this would be real quick and easy, but doing it for a camera, and I have newfound appreciation for these videos. Alright, I think we got that in one shot. Excellent. That is Luma, and then of course this red wire here is going to Chroma. So that's our S-Video that we're going to wrap the wire around on this side over here. I'm going to flip it around and hook it up to the RGB bypass board. So let's go ahead and jump to that. Alright, we're now back around to the other side for hooking up S-Video to the RGB bypass board. I've already stripped the wires as usual and pre-tinned them, so they're ready to solder right onto those pads. Solder. I'm going to use my tweezers to hold it down. It seems to work better for me doing that. There we go, just like that. Okay. Same deal for this guy. Look at that. Freaking perfect. Nice and tightly stretched around. Oh, look at that. That's just, you know, min-maxing your wire distances there. If we flip it over, you can see how it lines up on the chip there. Alright, so next step is going to be installing the 78SO5 regulator. Alright, so for the voltage regulator here, the first thing we want to do is reinstall the heat sink first, and then we're going to apply some MX4 thermal compound, a little dab to the 78SO5. Then we're going to bolt that to the heatsink after it's already been installed, and that way it'll perfectly align it so that when we go to solder it, it will be already set up and we won't have to worry about, oh crap, we did something backwards. So that's the proper order. So we'll get started on that now. Okay. So now, of course, for bolting the regulator to the heatsink, I'm going to have to add in that little dab of thermal compound. Just a little dab will do ya. It's probably too much. Yeah, look at that. It was glopped right out of there on me. Don't need a whole lot. Didn't expect that much of a mess, but oh well. We'll clean that up later. Let's see if I can. I'll probably have to use tweezers to do this. Slip the thing down into the slots there. There we go. Now for the tricky part of getting that screw through both the regulator and the heatsink. There we go. When I screw it in tight, that will mash that thermal compound all over where it's nice and thinly spread on it. There we go, nice and tight in there. Alright, it's in there. And now all we got to do is just solder the pins. Okay, so I'm ready to go ahead and solder these voltage regulator pins in. Got my iron heated up. I'm just going to start line feeding some solder into each pin. Get those soldered in. Actually, flux would help. This middle one I think is ground, why it takes so much longer to heat up. There it goes. And that's it. That voltage regulator is done. Alright, so I believe all that's left now is to redo that power LED indicator. I mean, since they already drilled the hole in the case, might as well use it. So let's go ahead and get started on redoing that. Okay, before we get started on wiring the LED power indicator, earlier I mentioned that you could actually pull both power and ground from the reset button terminals. And I showed you which pins were power and ground. Now, how would you go about, finding out if that were the case, which pins were which, and where to find them? Well, that's where your digital multimeter comes in, real handy with the continuity check. So we'll switch it over to that, and I'll show you. Now, originally, on their power LED indicator. They had ground down here on this terminal here, and they had power coming from the voltage regulator directly, which is up here. So those 2 points were where they pulled power and ground from. Now, if I want to find other places of ground, we can touch that same spot and start touching other areas. Like if we touch here, we get a beep. There's a beep. There's a beep. Beep. Those are all ground. That's not ground. That is ground. You know, it's that simple for doing that. To find the same power source in other areas, it's the same kind of continuity situation. So let's touch one to that power lead, and if we touch right there, we get continuity. So we know that is a 5-volt power terminal spot right there. And again, if we go for ground, we can see that as ground. So that's power, that's ground. Real easy to do. I mean, if you're going to do work like this, you got to get a digital multimeter. It's a must-have for modding. If just so you can find stuff like that, you know, if you're doing a different kind of mod than this, and you want to find your closest spots for power source or ground source, using the digital multimeter is the way to go. Because say you don't know, well, you know ground is going to be this stuff like, you know, where this screw is tied in, and you want to find another spot. See here, there, center thing. That's not going to work. That's not going to work. You know, you can just find different spots wherever you need to find ground. And the same thing for power. You just find where the power source is, and you start checking, you know, once again there, and you can check other places and find where power is, wherever you need it on the board. So I just wanted to show that, just as, you know, for beginners, that you got to have a digital multimeter for doing this kind of work. So let's go ahead and get started on the actual new wiring job that we're going to do for the power LED indicator. Alright, so what I've got here is micro JS wire, and it comes with male and female connectors, and I've sort of rigged up the female connector with some wire pins going into it, and normally it mounts on a board, like a PCB board, this female connector, and in fact I use these on all my Sega Genesis consoles that I service now. For the LED on that, because you know when you open those, the LED is hardwired to the console. Well, I fit these female connectors with these wires with the male input connector to the Genesis board, and it makes it to where you can just easily pull it apart and disconnect the top shell LED and all from the bottom shell of the motherboard of the Genesis. So I've got some proper shrink tubing on the parts of the wires that I've soldered to the female mounting connector, and I'm going to go ahead and shrink these tubes down with some hot air. I like to use 190 degrees Celsius on the hot air station for shrink tubing. That way it only shrinks the tube, doesn't melt any of your wiring, so go ahead and do that. I'll lower I don't need it to blow very fast air there. Alright, we're already up to temp, and we'll just heat these up and shrink them. And that's it. Nice and tight in there. Alright. So now we'll move on to soldering this to the reset button terminals, and then we'll hook up the resistor and the light emitting diode. Alright, I've stripped and tinned the wires to length to fit the terminals on the reset button. So we're going to go ahead and solder them, get that going. Let's start with the ground one first. It's on there pretty good. Maybe add a little more solder to it. There we go. That's not coming off of there now. Alright, now we'll go ahead and do the power. And voila. Much better usage for the light emitting diode power indicator. Instead of having, you know, the wires stretch all the way across the board like that. In fact, I'll zoom out if I can handle it. Oh, wrong way. Now it's just coming out of that one spot, and we have this nice connector here which we can pull apart and actually disconnect it from the top shell, just like I do with the Sega Genesis consoles. So let's go ahead and finally move on to the resistor and light emitting diode. Alright, so here on the LED I've gone ahead and tested it out, and actually I like the 1K resistor on there. It wasn't overly as bright as I thought, at least with this new LED that I'm using from my own supply. But one thing I wanted to point out is before soldering the resistor in, I slipped on some shrink tubing there, and that way I can bring it on over the resistor and shrink it down with some heat. I just want to point that out because sometimes you can paint yourself into a corner where you solder first and then you realize you forgot to slip on some loose shrink tube that you need to put on there, and then you end up having to desolder it and start over again. And you can see I've already shrink tubed the positive side here, you know, the 5-volt side. So we would just slide this shrink tube on over the resistor all the way up to the LED, and then we're going to use some hot air and shrink that down, and then we'll plug this back to the connector there and then hook it up to the console shell, and that should be done for this guy. So let's go ahead and get that done. Alright, let's see here. 190 degrees Celsius. And that's it. Alright, so next I'll go ahead and plug this in and show you with the LED actually powered on from the console. Alright, so here I've got it pretty dark so you can see the LED as I turn it on. And the camera, you know, you really can't see the color all that well, but it is purple, and it's nowhere near that bright. Cameras react to these, making them much more bright than they actually are in real life. When I'm looking at it right now, it's a very soft, deep, ultraviolet glow. You know, it's not, in fact, if I can cast a shadow on it, it's nowhere near that bright in person. It's I don't know what it is about cameras, but they really don't give you the actual, like, in-person effect of what the LED looks like. But there it is, powered from the reset button terminals, and this wire is much more flexible. It's not going to stress the LED. So we'll get this guy hooked back into the top shell and put this all back together and call it done.